Hi, I hope you can hear me. Good evening. It's morning here in New York, and it's great to be back in touch with all of you at IYAP. Remembering that it was just a few months ago we were together, working together in Sri Lanka. It seems like a short time ago, but a lot has happened. I'm grateful for the invitation. Thanks to all for the chance to reconnect, and especially now when we're all facing a sense of isolation, whether we're in social distancing mode or curfew or in quarantine. It's important to pull together and to be proactive, reaching out and supporting one another. And I know that IYAP is doing that. Networking is your DNA. It's your raison d'etre. So you're able to generate connectedness and solidarity, and we'll talk more about that. What I'm going to do is speak about child protection and think out loud about how it may apply in this situation, what it means, and what we can do collectively to strengthen the protective environment. The coronavirus crisis has really seized hold of the whole world. It's local, it's national, it's global, and its impacts are unprecedented. We're still in the middle of it. We're in the moment, and it's uncertain what will happen next. So the first thing to remember is that emergencies are opportunities to transform, to increase prevention measures, to improve services and response, and to strengthen resilience. And we hear a lot about resilience lately, individual resilience, community resilience. What resilience actually means is the capacity to recover quickly, literally to spring back. So in child protection, resilience is about risk-informed programming. It means taking an approach that anticipates the likely emergency scenarios and doing risk analysis to minimize shocks and stresses and reduce risk through preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery. Pandemics are part of that. They're part of the risk analysis. But a pandemic on this scale was not anticipated, and the preparation is never enough. So when an emergency strikes, and they always do, there are existing risks that are exacerbated. And there are new risks specific to the emergency, whether it's natural disaster or a war or a pandemic. The arrival on the scene of the coronavirus, or COVID-19, that's CO for corona, that's the shape of the virus, VI for virus, D for disease, and 19 for 2019. It's really changed the world abruptly from one day to the next. And that's what we call a sudden onset emergency. It's also a complex emergency because it hits many sectors at the same time with compounding impacts. There's a lot of statisticians now who are working on models of what is the likelihood of what will happen, different scenarios of recovery and the outbreak and how it will play out. But nobody really knows because a pandemic on this scale is not anything that we've seen in recent history or living memory. It's we're making it up as we go along, but we're making it up together. Because if there's one message to emerge from the corona crisis, it's that we're collectively learning that solidarity is the message, that this is a global threat that requires international solidarity. The first reaction was to close borders. Closing borders can help limit the number of cases of infection initially. However, the virus is already active in over 170 countries with infection rates trending upward. So the virus doesn't respect borders. So what are we going to do? The crisis provokes us to take action. It demands our attention, and it's no longer business as usual. What can we do in the midst of a crisis where what we're being told to do and even ordered to do is to stay at home? So the response is collective action to reduce the spread and the rate of infection and to flatten the curve. And the response that requires is solidarity. Solidarity on a scale we've not seen before that cuts across nationality, ethnic groups, religions, economic class, gender, you name it. We have to stand together. Nobody is excluded from this emergency. We're all on the same bus. It's maybe interesting moment to recall the opening lines to A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, because we have a choice here. It goes like this. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. So which way are we going to go? The virus is calling us out. The best and the worst in us is knocking on every door, so we have to answer it, and we will measure ourselves by what we do and how we respond. If we reflect and take a moment of reflection and say, yes, we have taken the world too much for granted. We do not have to resort to apocalyptic or dire predictions. Just wake up to the world that we're already living in. It's a shared world, and we need to take better care of our shared resources to protect the delicate balance that sustains life. And we have to take better care of all of each other. That the resources that we've used and exploited and taken for granted are now going to challenge us, and we have to face this situation, and we have no choice but to face the challenge together. The irony is that at a time when collective action and solidarity is our top priority, we are under curfew and in isolation. So it's a community in solidarity and isolation, which creates unprecedented challenge for our social relationships to be socially distancing at a time of crisis and loss. So it's imperative that we're good to each other, that we take care and we practice kindness. Regarding stigma associated with the virus, it's a huge challenge. And in any crisis, there's a tendency to look for a scapegoat. But when it comes to the coronavirus, we can't really afford to blame or bully or exclude or discriminate, because the virus doesn't do that. It doesn't discriminate. So how we then bridge the isolation and the social distancing and sheltering in place, the curfew and the quarantine, we need to reach out. That's what you're doing. And you're setting example. You're setting precedent in the way you're connecting. That effort makes a difference, and it helps us recognize our common humankind and the solidarity that is now essential for our survival. So that's a few thoughts on the situation of the crisis. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a quick overview of some child protection terms and child protection strategy, and then link it to the virus. To start with child protection, it means or refers to preventing and responding to violence, exploitation, and abuse against children. Violence against children refers to all forms of physical or mental injury, abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Exploitation is the use of children for someone else's economic or sexual advantage or gratification or profit. Child abuse is physical and psychological harm or threats of harm, and includes neglect. The child protection measures and structures to help prevent and respond to physical, emotional, or psychological abuse that includes commercial sexual exploitation, child trafficking, child labor, abuse in the home, in the school, in the community, and harmful and abusive traditional practices such as child marriage, for example. Child protection is based on a child rights approach that is human rights based, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the optional protocols at the foundation. And that's emphasizing both prevention as well as accountability of governments and other stakeholders. It highlights the roles and responsibilities of children and families and communities as agents of change and actors in their own right, strengthening the protective environment. And then if we look at the framework of child protection, usually we say there's two pillars. There's systems and social norms. So if we talk about child protection systems, that's comprised of laws, policies, services across all the social sectors, especially social welfare, education, health systems, justice, and all to support the prevention and response to protection and related risks. And at the level of prevention, the aim is to support and strengthen families to lower the risk of violence. And then when we talk about strengthening systems to improve child protection, we call that upstream work. Then we have the other pillar, which is social norms. And that's the basis for positive social change. So social norms and traditional practices also include harmful norms. For example, if violence is used to discipline children, then if it's accepted as a social norm, then we need new standards and methods of nonviolent discipline to be introduced, and that requires collective action. Positive social change requires engagement and buy-in of the whole community, families, communities, networks for partnership, and collective action. That's all part of the protective environment. So now, what is the protective environment? That we could talk about for a long time. I'm going to be very brief and just give an overview of how we see the protective environment with the child at the center, and then the environment, we usually say, is composed of about 8 elements or components. So briefly, we have the government commitment to child protection and child rights, and that includes social welfare policies, budgeting, etc. Then we have legislation and enforcement. That's the legal framework. It's the implementation, accountability, the CRC and its protocols. Then we have the attitudes, traditions, that's the social norms, the customs that collectively prevent violence and support protection. We have open discussion. That includes media, outreach, civil society, and it's really participatory government. And then we have children's own capacities, their life skills, knowledge, and their participation as actors in their own protection. And then we have the capacity of those who are in contact with the child. And that means building the capacities of families, community members, also teachers, health and social workers, the police, everyone, in order to protect children. Then we have the delivery of basic and targeted services that, as we mentioned, the basic social services, health, education, and also specific services to prevent violence and exploitation and to provide care and support. And lastly, the 8th one, monitoring and oversight. That's the effective systems of monitoring, such as data collection and oversight of response. Now, so that's the protective environment when we speak about it. Now, in emergencies, medium-scale natural disasters or low-intensity armed conflicts, existing child protection systems generally continue to function to a certain degree, and that's critical. It's very important. In rapid onset emergencies also, these systems play an important role in the response. And we're seeing that now. That's happening now. We're doing that now. In child protection, in emergencies where child protection systems do not exist or have been significantly weakened, then we build on positive community mechanisms and strengthening the capacity of local actors, civil society, and so on to build back better. Okay. Now, I suppose we're running out of it. I want to now take a moment to connect that and think about how this child protection system and work, how that relates to the current crisis, the risks and response. Because first of all, there's the risk of the virus itself, that is the possibility of infection of children and families and communities, and the related risks due to the impacts of the virus causing a breakdown and erosion of the protective environment. And then there's reduced family income and our reliance on others to provide and to transport goods and services. Even the measures that we are taking to prevent and control the spread of COVID-19 can expose children to protection risks, the quarantine and the isolation measures. That limits access to food and services and can negatively impact children and their families. Also, the enclosure itself, the lockdown, it creates stresses, psychosocial or psychological stress and trauma, and violence can result. We have school closures, and restricted movement can limit access to healthcare. So mitigation measures are needed, remote schooling and mobile healthcare. And then, as mentioned, there's the stigma and discrimination that's related to COVID-19. The stigmatization of infected persons or groups, suspected even to be infected, that can make children more vulnerable to being targeted for violence and psychosocial distress. With regard to the stigma, not only do we know that the geographic, ethnic, and religious labels for the disease are wrong, that kind of discrimination or stigmatization, it actually can discourage testing and access to treatment and care. And it can result as well in mental and physical violence. So this pandemic has already demonstrated that no ethnic, religious, or geographic group faces greater risk than any other. So we have to recognize the vulnerability of all and act accordingly. We also need to establish a safety net for the most vulnerable, including refugees, internally displaced, the elderly, persons who are institutionalized, persons with disabilities, as well as those who are homeless, children without parental care, and children living on the street, informal workers, and those with pre-existing health risks. It's also critical to focus on the impacts related to gender that may expose more women to infection because of their role as caregivers within families and on the front line. Also, the power differentials that can leave women and children, especially girls, without a voice in decision-making. And the increase in gender-based violence, it always occurs in emergency settings, including the risk of sexual violence, spouse abuse, domestic violence, gender discrimination, all typically surge during emergencies. In a case where we have curfew, it's greatly exacerbated. And then children and families who are already vulnerable due to poverty, or those who live in overcrowded neighborhoods, are particularly at risk. And as usual, it's the most vulnerable who are the most at risk. So we need coordinated response across sectors. For example, child protection linking with health. An example in the health sector is a recent shift in nurse-family partnership. Nurse-family partnership employs nurses to provide home visits and home care to families with vulnerable mothers and children. But in the pandemic, they had to shift really quickly from home visits to telehealth, providing access, advice, and healthcare by phone with follow-up in person as needed. And to do that, they had to get hold of thousands of phones and create web accounts, all of that happening in real time. And the wash sector, I mean, that we know it's critical. That's wash, that's water, and sanitation and hygiene. To provide child-friendly hand washing stations at health facilities, at schools, child care centers, alternative care, wherever children are likely to visit. And washing, of course, washing hands at home. To promote and provide safe child-friendly hygiene activities, both before and during this outbreak, is essential. And then education. I mean, the number of children out of school in the world right now, it's unprecedented. The number of schools closed and the operations that are remote at a level we haven't seen before. This increases risks for children. So it's important to limit the impact of school interruption by using child-friendly distant education, such as TV, radio, online learning, and to make flexible work arrangements for parents and caregivers so they can support it, and to work with schools so that protection and safety measures are delivered to parents and children in a way that limits the panic and distress. And there are many other sectors. I know we're running out of time. I want to say also advocacy, promoting child protection through raising awareness, working in partnership and through networks remotely to engage civil society and young people for prevention of violence and protection measures. And that's what you guys are doing. And you're doing it really well, very effectively. So I hope you really keep up because it's great. I want to mention economic impacts because this is what we call a compounding effect of the virus. The economic impacts and shock waves are just beginning to be felt, and they're likely to continue for some time. There are the macro impacts on governments going into debt and the long-term impacts of indebtedness on a scale we haven't seen, and that directly impacts children and their families. And then there are local impacts on people who are already economically disadvantaged, living month to month, who suddenly are unable to pay rent, to buy food, to afford education. The risks to children and families suffering from the economic crisis are far-reaching. The loss of education, the loss of opportunity, loss of family and social safety net. The physical and psychosocial stresses are enormous, and they require a resilience that we as a world are not prepared for. So we have to come together and we have to care for each other in solidarity. Again, that's our message. Some people are referring to this crisis even as a test case for the crises that we may anticipate due to climate change and the environmental damage to our planet. Whether or not those crises will force us to change our ways. So that's another area of concern and debate and of attention for child protection. What do we do in the immediate term, and what is the long-term plan for both prevention and response? I know we're out of time. I want to close with a short poem by W.S. Merwin, and he passed away last year. This is, like I said, an abbreviated and slightly revised version, and the poem is titled "Thanks." The poem. Listen. With the night falling, we are saying thank you. We are stopping on the bridges to bow down. We are running out of our homes to look at the sky and say thank you. We are standing by the water, thanking it, standing by the windows, looking out in our different directions. Over cell phones, we are saying thank you. In doorways and in our living rooms, in the faces of those who do not listen, and all who will never listen, we go on saying thank you. Thank you. We are saying thank you to the oceans, to the forests, to the air, to no one in particular. We are saying thank you with the words going out like signals to the cities and the countries where we live and where we do not live. We are saying thank you faster and faster with nobody listening. We are saying thank you. We are saying thank you, and we are waving to each other, dark through though it is. So I want to thank you all and wish you well, and please be safe and be well. And I know you're going to find a way to turn this emergency into an opportunity to make the world a better and a more caring, more peaceful world. And I'll sign off here and really, again, thank you with our new handshake to the namaste, and a very, very big wish for all of you, for your safety, for your well-being, and hope to see you again. Bye.